All right, hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. Today we're sitting down with a brand new guest. His name is Brendan Barca, and he has written an incredible book with his wife, Pema Sherpa. The book is called The Daily Buddhist, 366 Days of Wisdom for Happiness, Inner Freedom, and Mindful Living. And so, Brendan, welcome to the podcast. I'm excited to have some time with you.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Glenn. Excited to be here.
Absolutely. So first things first, for people who maybe are new to you and the work that you do in the world, maybe tell us a little bit about yourself. Who are you? What do you do? The general intro into the life of Brendan.
Yeah, so I guess first and foremost, I'm a father and a husband. So my wife, Pema, who you mentioned earlier, we've been together now 7.5 years. We actually met at a bar in Brooklyn, so that kind of started our joint adventure together in life. And now, as business partners and as parents, we have a 1 year old that we were talking about before he came on, our daughter Samaya. So that's been our biggest project. Although, as you can see, we also have a book, so we have a lot going on here. But just to kind of give you the full scope. We've been in business together now for about 7 years, and predominantly we do professional speaking and training for companies and either their employees and their clients. A lot of our topics relate around mindfulness, mindset. Also talk about sometimes emotional intelligence, but really, we've been noticing in the last, call it 5 years, that a lot of clients and their employees have needed mindfulness, have needed meditation, especially with the pandemic 5 years ago. And that prompted us to create something new. And that's where this book comes in, helping them to have these daily micro practices to help them to, reduce stress or increase well-being. And so that's what we do at a super high level. But yeah, we work together every day in work and in parenthood.
I love that. Yeah, I used to work for Apple for 11 years, and I guess towards the end, maybe like definitely in the during the pandemic, but they really got into mental health type stuff, and they bought us all a subscription to the 10% Happier app, and then we would have like different competitions within the company for meditation stuff like that, but they were really helping us kind of take care of our minds, which was very new for the retail world because not many companies were doing that kind of a thing at that time, but it seems like it's becoming more of the norm now.
Yeah, I think it's come a long way. So I was never I was in tech for a little bit, but I was more in financial services. That's where I
Mhm.
started my career. And I was in sales there in like kind of a typical high pressure sales environment, which we can get to later into how that led me towards mindfulness meditation and Buddhism. But anyways, I saw back then when I was at that company that there wasn't too many resources for that, right? The resources were how to develop in your career, how to be able to get ahead, but there wasn't much to help you with your mental health. And I think the pandemic is what kind of set that trajectory in motion as they realized they needed this to, of course, retain employees, but also hopefully, to help people personally. And so that's where we saw the opportunity. And I mean, my wife Emma studied philosophy and meditation. She comes from Nepal, so she's been meditating and practicing Buddhism her whole life. And so we saw an opportunity to help clients here in the US. So that's where we come from. And I think it's a great thing for employees to have that. And we all need that, myself included.
Yeah, definitely, definitely. And sometimes it can feel like, I mean, I know for me at Apple, it felt like I remember I think it was one of the higher ups in the company came in and they said to our leadership team, they said, we're not doing this mental health stuff just to put a band-aid on the problem. Like we're trying to help the employees become more mindful and really take care of themselves because we do work in a high pressure environment, but that doesn't, because we're trying to help the employees work on this, it doesn't give the leadership a license to push them harder kind of a thing, like it's meant to help integrate into the store and into the team. So
Yeah, and I think you can tell now which companies are still going the course versus the
yeah.
ones that have maybe wound those projects down. So, we're kind of seeing that difference just in terms of our client set. But I think this is a long-term investment for companies, but also just for everyone out there, because none of us give ourselves really the care we need. We maybe work too hard in certain areas of our life, whether it's career or even, being parents, and then we stretch ourselves so thin. And so to have these practices, whether it is meditation or, it could be anything, it could be like prayers, it could be mantras, it could be just going for a walk. Sometimes we don't give ourselves permission to do those things, and it mounts up. All these little things compound, and if we don't give ourselves a break, then we can really, burn out, which I speak to from experience.
Yeah, I always say that our nervous systems are not wired to handle the amount of stuff that we tend to put on it, right?
Yeah, I know,
Yeah,
absolutely.
for sure. All right, so what I'm most interested in hearing a little bit about is your faith story because I don't know much about you. I mean, I obviously went through your website. I've been going through your book and things like that, but um I just want to hear a little bit about like where you come from. You know, I feel like the book from what I've read and really all the work that you do, it seems like it comes from a very personal place, not just like an intellectual place, but a very lived place. Like I could tell like Brendan's been here. The stuff that he's talking about is really kind of bleeding through, is coming from a very passionate place. So I know from our email exchange, you said that you grew up sort of Christian and you discovered Buddhism later on. So maybe take us into the story of you and faith and God and spirituality. You know, how were you raised regarding those things? Where are you at now? And what are some of the things that brought you from there to here?
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in the suburbs of Massachusetts, and that part of the country is very Catholic. So it's a lot of Italian and Irish, former immigrants from a couple generations ago that have now settled into Massachusetts. And I think my town was, well, I don't know the percentages, but it felt like over 80% Catholic. So most people all went to the same church, and I was baptized and went to CCD, or religious education training for kids, and
Yeah.
got my confirmation. So kind of was taking the steps, but at the same time, my family at that point and still today wasn't overly religious. So my dad had actually been raised very, I guess I thought very Catholic. I don't know if it's the right term, but he was raised in a Catholic
Super
family, and
Catholic.
yeah, right. I don't know what to say. And he went to Catholic school like all the way up to college, and I think at one point, he was even considering becoming a priest. And then I guess he would be better to tell that story than me, but he kind of had a change of heart and just kind of went to maybe a more open route where he still practiced spirituality, still, would pray in his own way and think about God. But it kind of, by the time we were there in the picture, my sister and I, we never were going to church every Sunday. So we weren't part of that, but we were still learning and kind of maybe practicing and learning some of the ethics that involved with like the church and the education. So, that's how I was brought up. But then by the time I was in college, I went to school in upstate New York. It pretty much had an open landscape for trying to explore spirituality and try to figure out, the world for myself. And that kind of continued into my 20s. There wasn't much exploration happening in college. That was more just fun. But by the time I was in my 20s and I was in that career and I started to experience, heightened stress or anxiety, and, I was trying to look for answers more, like a really exploratory phase of my life. And I actually, well, it kind of led me. I've heard about meditation through a friend who said that she had tried it. And to me, it was the first time I heard of anyone personally who had meditated, right? I'd heard of that, but it sounded like this kind of far out idea. I very much was like, raised in a bubble in the US, in this suburb of Massachusetts. And then I heard about this and I thought, oh, that's kind of interesting. And she kind of told me some of the things that she experienced, like the things I was looking for, which is like calming my mind and, trying to work on my inner critic. And so I tried meditation, I think that very day. And that was about 10 years ago. And I just never stopped. And so that was my first foray into, now, which is more traditional Buddhist practice. But it all started with hearing about meditation and then just continuing that because I really found the benefit, and then learning about mindfulness, learning some different Buddhist texts, and not just Buddhism. I've read a lot of Eckhart Tolle back then, and Deepak Chopra. So there's like a whole, the spiritual kind of Eastern perspective I was really into. And then once Pema and I met, she was more formally Tibetan Buddhist. That's how she grew up in Nepal. And so that kind of led me toward that direction. And now we've been practicing that more formally for the last 7 years. So kind of a long answer, but that's kind of my general trajectory.
Yeah. Now, are there different, like, and this might sound like I'm not super versed in Buddhism, but are there like different, you said Tibetan Buddhism. Is there other versions of Buddhism? And is that similar to, again, coming from my background in Christianity, like different denominations? Like, do different, like, sects of Buddhism believe different things? Or what is that about?
Yeah, great question. So just like to kind of back up, like all of Buddhism started about 2,500 years ago from the Buddha.
Mhm.
And so basically, he was looking for answers to his own personal suffering. Like he was born a wealthy and privileged prince, but found that he was still, still anxious, still struggling with like everyday challenges that you and I do. And so he went off on his own to kind of on this quest to figure out how to unpack this and find
Mhm.
happiness. And so eventually, after years of experimenting with different methods, like he actually became an ascetic for a while and tried that road, but he realized that really whether he was an ascetic or he was practicing like more of a hedonist, it was suffering either way. So he found more of the middle way, as what's been called and known. And he meditated under the Bodhi tree, as the story goes, which helped him find his enlightenment. And then he started teaching things that he had discovered. And that's where the first teaching was called the Four Noble Truths. So really, Buddhism started with one man's journey and one man's discovery of, what they call as enlightenment or like the Great Awakening. And so it started there. And that was back in, I mean, Nepal, India, like around that area. He lived in both, but before it was called Nepal or India. So this is a long time ago. And then what happened was over the years, people started, just like in Christianity, right? People started to talk about this. The disciples started to spread the teachings. And so over time, Buddhism spread from India up to Tibet, over to Pakistan, Afghanistan, over to Vietnam, China, Japan. And so as it spread, what happens is people develop different sort of different ways of practicing. And so there's Tibetan Buddhism, which is predominantly practiced in Tibet, or now it's a lot since Tibet had all the different struggles it's gone through over the last 100 years. There's a lot in Nepal and India, but there's also classical Indian Buddhism, which is more like Theravada Buddhism. There's Chan Buddhism, which is mostly China, and there's Zen Buddhism, which we've heard of, which is mostly in Japan. But yeah, they have different like religious practices,
Mhm.
but all of them come from the core teachings of the Four Noble Truths and the Eightfold Path. So that's a little bit about the differences between all the ones.
Yeah, now do each group, there's another question that comes from my background. Does each group like respect the other? Because like I think of like in Christianity, there's not always that level of respect for the other denomination. It's more like we're right and they're wrong. Like is there that kind of like like that kind of inner battle within the system, or does everybody kind of have like a mutual respect for the other?
Yeah, well, even within the different different areas, like for example, even within Tibetan Buddhism, there's like four major lineages they're called. So there's like for example, there's Nyingma, there's Gelug, and and within those, there's different belief systems too. But they've really been working on the last, especially the current Dalai Lama has been working on trying to unite, like see specifically like Tibetan Buddhism, but like trying to unite the four lineages and kind of seeing the benefits to all their very beliefs because they're all so they have a lot of similarities, but just a
Mhm.
couple things that maybe they disagree on, like the ancient text, how they're interpreted. So I'd say there's, it's there hasn't been, like wars over, these things, but
Mhm.
I think there's just disagreement. There's like philosophical debates over the centuries that have happened. But I think it's mostly peaceful versus maybe some of the old Christian wars in like medieval Europe and things like that.
Yeah. So what are some of the like overlaps between Buddhism and Christianity? I know you said you're not super versed in Christianity, which is fine, but I get a lot of questions about like how Buddhism intersects with Christianity because it seems like a lot of more mystical minded Christians are more open to Buddhist principles and kind of integrating those things to their faith. And some Buddhists, like I know Thich Nhat Hanh is kind of like a one of the more famous ones, makes a lot of references to the teachings of Jesus. So clearly there's some parallels, as minor as they may be, and there's also obviously a lot of differences. So since a lot of our listeners come from a more Christian tradition, I thought it might be helpful if you have any wisdom to kind of share into, how Buddhist principles might be able to make somebody even a better follower of the teachings of Jesus.
Yeah, I think from my understanding, some of the things that I remember from my upbringing in Christianity definitely overlap with Buddhism. Like one thing that jumps out is the ethical teachings,
Mhm.
or like what it's called in Buddhism is ethical living. And there's actually a Sanskrit word for that, shila. And that's one of the three main aspects of the Eightfold Path, which, by the way, the Eightfold Path is the path that one would take towards enlightenment. So there's a couple different elements of it, and ethical living is one of them. And underneath that, is ethical or right speech, right action, and right livelihood. And so that might, like a lot of the things like we practice I remember practicing Christianity, whether it's, loving others, being compassionate, being kind, being generous, like all these things are also there in Buddhism, and forgiving others, right? And so these are all things that I remember from my past that are still there in Buddhism, that might people might be able to relate to. And I mean, the main difference or the biggest difference is that Buddhism is non-theistic. So it's focusing on trying to help someone find personal enlightenment. And there's no, deity like a god. So that's like the biggest difference. But I think in terms of the conduct and the ethical living, and I think even mindfulness is some aspect of, it's not called that in Christianity. It's all working on your mind, working on your inner demons, and then trying to use that to extend outwards, understand other people, be able to, conduct yourself in the world, and also find your own salvation. So those are a couple of things that I've thought of in terms of the overlap.
Yeah. Is there also an emphasis in Buddhism on like the idea of oneness and like interconnectedness between people? Is that a thing? Because I've noticed that in particular, a lot of mystical minded Christians. So again, Christians who are embracing more of the mystery of understanding things as opposed to having like a dogma or a specific doctrine, just kind of open to a lot of different ways of thinking. I feel like that's a movement within that branch of Christianity that I think, and you correct me if I'm wrong, that I've seen also within Buddhism.
Yeah, it is. And actually it's in the book. I think if you're reading along with the calendar, you haven't gotten there yet, but the second chapter in the book is about interdependence.
Mhm.
And so, with any traditional Buddhist teaching, they usually start in two main areas, which is impermanence, so understanding that all things change, at the most basic level, and then also interdependence, which is that everything is interconnected, right? Whether it's our actions, like cause and effect, that's one person, but also the interconnectedness of us as humans. First of all, that we all share the same suffering and our pain and our anger and our happiness and our quest for salvation. And so, this is very much so. I don't know how it is similar to how they explain it in Christianity, but it's very much something that we work on in Buddhism.
Yeah, I recently somebody was a more mystical minded writer was saying that Jesus' command to love your neighbor as yourself is because you're so connected to your neighbor that what you do to your neighbor, you in essence do to yourself. What you do to yourself, in essence do to your neighbor. So treat your neighbor in the way that you want to be treated because in essence that's how you're treating yourself. And so it's like that deep sense of connectedness that and again, in the branch of Christianity that I was brought up in, there was a lot of separateness. It was us versus them. It was they're wrong,
Mhm.
we're right. There was lots of different divisions, lots of black and white. But I feel like this other realm of the Christian faith is trying to bring those sides together. And I feel like that harmonizes so nicely with what you just said regarding Buddhism.
Yeah, and I think also just with today's times where there's a lot of division, and one of the things that Buddhism helps to understand, like there's various practices, but one key thing is called exchange of self and others, which is
Mm,
similar to what you just mentioned, which is whether it's trying to understand the other side's perspective, or whether it's trying to understand the similarity between you and your neighbor who might make you angry or make you upset, and trying to erase that line in the sand, because what it all comes to, at least from a Buddhist perspective, is our sort of like our attachment to our own beliefs, our own identity, and thinking that like our way's right, or our family deserves this, or I deserve that. When so what we're saying is like we deserve it over the other person, or we believe this, and the other person's beliefs are ridiculous or whatever.
mhm.
But it's like seeing that first of all, our attachment to ourselves is unhealthy, but also just that the reality is that, well, we don't necessarily know, what perspective is correct, or even if this person might be making us angry, it doesn't mean that you know they're not a good person. It just means that they have a different view set. So we're all trying to unpack that, whether it's exchanging ourself with them. Also, a thing we practice in Buddhism is equanimity, which there's a couple interpretations of equanimity, but a couple layers of it, I should say. So there's the idea of like a balanced mind, so just kind of seeing things from a state of equanimity, whether it's, for example, if it's like a good event in life, like let's say you, I don't know, win $1,000, you might see that as good, versus if I don't know if
You lost $1,000.
yeah, if you lose $1,000, right? So, but there's the stories in Buddhism around how you don't know what that could lead to. Let's say you
Yeah,
buy it, you get win $1,000, and then that leads to someone stealing that from you, and then you get upset, and it creates this whole thing in your life that wouldn't have been there before. So, anyways, there's an equanimity in terms of balanced state of mind, but also equanimity in terms of your balanced view of other people. So, how can you see everyone as equal? And even if you disagree, is it possible to disagree with while still acknowledging the shared humanity? And that's the question we want to ask ourselves when someone does maybe make us upset because they might have a different view than us.
that's right. That's a good segue into compassion, which I wanted to talk to you a little bit about. The pamphlet that your publisher sent me the book, which thank you for having that done for me. But they also sent me a little pamphlet, along with the book, and it has all these different things about how the Daily Buddhist book can help someone, with different things in their life. And one of the things on that list is cultivating a life of compassion and how that can lead you to a greater sense of joy or greater sense of happiness. And that made me think, just like you were just talking, we live in a world where people are generally unhappy with their lives, maybe unhappy with the world, unhappy with the direction the world sometimes seems to be headed. Social media is constantly, hammering us with stories that create fear and anxiety and worry and anger and all these different things. And it's so easy to other people and, create these different sides like we've been talking about. And therefore, we kind of live in a time where it's pretty challenging to live a life of compassion, especially when there's such a strong sense of division in regards to politics to demonize that other side and things like that. So, can you talk to us a little bit about some practical ways that mindfulness and meditation specifically can help us, help everyday people, like people that you work with on a regular basis, develop a greater sense of compassion? And how that compassion can help us live a happier, more joyful life, as the book promises.
Yeah, lofty promise, but I think it can set people on the path to it.
Yep.
So, so I, so a couple things come to mind, like you mentioned, meditation and mindfulness, how they can help us to cultivate more compassion. And so I'll start with meditation. So the traditional meditation practice, it would be like, let's say, a seated meditation where you're sitting with yourself and, you could be following the breath. There, some people will, maybe listen to some soothing sounds. From a traditional, like Tibetan Buddhist perspective, usually you're just practicing, or you want to be practicing uh, breathwork meditation where there is no other sounds, there's no one guiding you. So that's just from that standpoint. But really, what meditation is supposed to help you do, like through that, because what happens is once you sit in that, you notice all the thoughts and all the narratives and all the stories that happen in your own head that are ruminating up there. That when we're like in our everyday life, we don't have time to see or address because we're so distracted. And so, what meditation is really supposed to help us do is have, first of all, a deeper understanding of ourselves. And by sitting there and seeing, oh wow, I just had that random thought, or I just had that, stressful idea, or I just had this like happy, maybe daydream, whatever it is, we kind of start to see, how we think about ourselves, how we think about others, any confusions we have, any negative emotions we're dealing with. And so it's almost like getting to know a friend. Like when you sit down to get to know a friend over coffee week after week or day after day, eventually you're going to get to know them. You're going to maybe have a soft spot for them. And so first it starts with self-compassion, because if you can see yourself, you can see that, okay, you're having these confused thoughts. You're kind of like struggling on your own. You can hopefully, in the practices, to kind of see yourself as someone who deserves love, who deserves compassion. So it starts there. And then once you're able to kind of see that and then realize, oh, wow, if I'm having these thoughts, if I'm having these troubles, all 7 or 8 billion people out there are
It's
having
not
the
just
same
me.
thing, right? Yeah, picture everyone out there. Like, look, I'm looking out the window in New York and I can see all these other buildings. It's like, just imagine like going on everyone's head on the street. And it's like, then you realize, whoa, everyone's going through these same challenges. So no wonder like someone honked at me. No wonder someone in the line tried to cut me to get their coffee first. No wonder my partner is upset because they didn't sleep well, whatever it is. And so once you understand that yourself, then the compassion can start to extend outwards. So that's what one of the biggest, or one benefit of meditation is: understand self, you be compassionate to there, and it takes time. You don't just start with self love. That's hard for a lot of us. Although at one point the Dalai Lama thought that was so. There was like a interview once where he was over here like years ago, and they were saying, or if someone was telling them like, how do I work on self-hatred? And he's like, he didn't understand what self-hatred was.
Mm,
He couldn't fathom that people could actually hate themselves. And then eventually he learned that a lot of people in the West were dealing with that. And so, anyways, meditation is one way to do that. The other part you asked is mindfulness. And
mm,
so, one of the things that starts to develop from meditation practice, although you're not in seated meditation as you're actively practicing, is mindfulness, and that's also like watching the mind and being able to control the mind when you're out in the real world. So let's say, for example, your neighbor yells at you because your dog peed on their lawn or whatever it is. Well, then in that moment, depending on how much self control you have or how much you've kind of worked on yourself, you could, have several thoughts that go in your mind. And then it's like, how do you react in that moment? And, by first through seated meditation, but then also just by watching your mind more and more, hopefully these reactions, like first, hopefully your thoughts about the person might start to change, but more likely at the beginning, you can kind of change your action towards them. And then, by doing that, you can kind of start to soften up and see, okay, this person yelled at me, but they're dealing with their own confused thoughts, they're dealing with their own actions. And so how can I like see myself in them and then maybe act more compassionately to them? So that's the way to do it like out in real life is to kind of see your thoughts for what they are, see that other people are confused just like you, and then, act, and that goes back to ethical living, act the way that you wish someone would act towards you, which is with
mm.
patience and understanding.
Yeah. That's really good. We've been working with our daughter. She's 8. I mentioned that before we hit record. And she's at that age where she's learning. She has all these different feelings, all these different emotions, and sometimes, as you know, as adults, it can be hard to regulate our own emotions and our own nervous systems. And one of the conversations we had with her a while back, we had this idea of the mind table. And we told her, imagine like a big, big table, and you're at the head of the table, and around the table you have anger, and you have fear, and you have sadness, and you have jealousy, and you have all these different feelings that are around the table, and they're all screaming for attention. And every once in a while, one of them kind of stands up and makes a big fuss and a big ruckus, but at the head of the table is still, you. Is still your true self, the one that's kind and compassionate and patient and all these different things. And we talked about trying to understand that all those other feelings are welcome, but they don't all sit at the head of the table. You sit at the head of the table. And to access that place, oftentimes it helps to take just a deep breath in the moment. And so, we noticed that she was having trouble controlling her anger, for instance, and she would just, go from 0 to 1,000 miles an hour, and just having that, when you feel that spark inside, take that deep breath and, speak from that place of calmness and that place of peace as opposed to the place of anger. And that seems to have really helped her a lot. So I guess it's a way that we've talked about mindfulness to her, I guess, in a more kid-friendly way that seems to have clicked for her.
Yeah, even with our 1 year old, I don't know when I started this, but whenever she gets frustrated, like she's gotten into like trying to like open every pen cap and things like that. But whenever it's stuck, first she's learned the word stuck, which helps her to like name whatever's happening. But
Yep.
the other thing is when she gets worked up, then we tell her like take a breath or breathe, and she gets it. She seems to be a pretty quick learner, and she'll take that breath, and it'll create a huge difference in then what happens next. Like she's not gonna get to a level of maybe crying or a thing like that, but more of like redirect and maybe try something else or ask for help. So there's that. And I was going to go back to your analogy of the table for a moment. So I think another way that I think that's great, and I think that's perfect. Another thing we think about from like a Buddhist philosophy perspective um, is thinking of like these emotions as clouds.
Mm,
And so like let's say you have that cloud of anger, the cloud of jealousy, the cloud of sadness, whatever that is, and I think the one thing we also try to do is think of our mind as separate from our thoughts and separate from our emotions.
mm,
So if you have a thought that you're unworthy, if you have a thought or an emotion that you're sad or whatever those are the clouds, right? And then our mind is more like the open awareness, like the open sky.
mm,
And so I think that's one thing we try to think about is like, because we could say, oh, we're the sun, but then from a Buddhist perspective, then we're kind of giving ourselves another identity. Whereas like the mind is more thought of as like more of a vast open space. And so I think that's another way to think about it. Maybe not good for an 8-year-old just yet, but thinking of it as like, okay, we're the ones that's like letting all these things pass through. We're the one watching, and that doesn't mean so we're not those things. And I think that kind of difference can help people to deal with their own, their own troubled thoughts and emotions that I know we're all practicing.
Yeah, I mean, it's helpful to know. I mean, we are not our thoughts, right? I mean, I feel like that's for the longest time I associated myself with my thoughts. I had this thought, and it might be something that seemed really, really horrible. I'm like, oh my goodness, like I'm a terrible person because I had this terrible thought. And it's like, no, it's these thoughts do not equal who I am. And I noticed that a lot in when I started to practice meditation because, I felt like I was doing with the 10% Happier app when I worked at Apple, and I think it was Joseph Goldstein was doing like a leaded guided meditation. And man, I'm telling you, Brendan, like for the first like 30 seconds, I had like 1,000 different thoughts in my head, and I was like, I've never been so aware of how many thoughts I have when I'm trying to just direct my attention to something as simple as my breath. And he kept saying, begin again, begin again, begin again. And then I just started to realize, like, oh my goodness, like I have all these different thoughts, but yet at the same time, they feel, as much as they feel like they're connected to me, they feel so separate from me because I'm almost like sitting in a balcony now, viewing them passing by at 100 miles an hour, and that helped me really realize just the again that way that I associate myself with my thoughts and to be able to separate myself from that was just a very helpful thing.
Yeah, there's also another fun analogy with that. It's like the difference between, being in a movie versus the one that's sitting in the audience watching the movie.
Hmm.
And there's a quote by Milarepa in our book, who is one of the most famous Tibetan um, Buddhist masters from over 1,000 years ago now. But he says those that understand the mind can sit back and watch and be ever joyful. And
Hmm.
what he's kind of saying there is like, if you understand that these thoughts aren't your own, if you can have the craziest thoughts, and I notice these now, I'm like, wow, that was a thought. Like, was that me? Like, it could be a, a really hateful thought. It could be a, like it just comes out of nowhere. And then you could really maybe beat yourself up over that. But if you can kind of sit back and say, wait a minute, like that just, it's not to give ourselves excuses. And like, okay, if we take that thought and then make it action or make it speech, right? And then it's affecting someone else, then all of a sudden, okay, we have to take a step back and work on our mind and kind of work on our reaction. But if we can kind of see these thoughts ping ponging around or on the movie screen, like up there, like as if it's a drama going on, we can kind of sit back and maybe have some popcorn and watch and kind of laugh at these. I think that's another way to think about it, is like try to take it a little bit less seriously and not like, yeah, like I said, beat ourselves up over the fact that we had a thought that maybe is either negative towards us or someone else. Because the truth is, we're not our thoughts, and these are things happening more or less to us, and from our old habits, from society, from all these things that are coming through us on social media. And so we just have to be the ones that are kind of watching and regulating, so they're not impacting our well-being or other people's.
That's right. So good. One of the things I thought was interesting, and maybe we could end with this, it kind of segues into this idea, but I can't remember exactly where I saw the idea. Maybe it was in the book. It might even have been on your website, but it was somewhere. And the idea, and I'm going to summarize it, so feel free to correct me if I misspeak it. But the idea is that this work of Buddhism, this work of your book, all the things we've been talking about, it's not so much giving us the power to change the world and make it different than it is, but more so the ability to see the world and to see our lives from like a different, perhaps more elevated perspective. And I think that that's like a radical approach because the system I was raised in, we were taught to be world changers. The world is a mess and it's our job to come in and fix it and make it as it should be. And then Jesus is going to come back and he's going to fix it once and for all. But this idea that the vibe I'm getting from your book and our conversation, it feels like, the world is as it is. And rather than invest all this energy and worry and anxiety trying to make it into something else, it's almost like there's this certain level of freedom to take it as it is and focus on the kind of person, the kind of life that we're going to lead in the midst of it. Like, how can I live a life of compassion now, a life of love now, life of patience now, in whatever state the world is in, whether it's a good state or a not so good state, but that's not as much of a concern as the type of person I'm going to live as. So is that the kind of am I on the right track of thinking?
Yeah, I think I forget where that comes from. I mean, I know it's maybe from our side, but
I
I
saw it
can't picture
somewhere.
the actual page or the website. But I think one thing we all should think about, like we could think, in our time now, it's so difficult. Like we're all divided. We could think this and think, okay, once we get the next thing, then we're going to feel better. Or
Yeah.
once this next stage of our life happens, things are going to be better, right? It could be more, yeah, I don't know, more political peace. It could be more money personally. It could be our family is in more harmony. But like one of the things that we learn from the Buddhist teachings is that suffering is pervasive, right? You could, get like the best job and the best life and move to Costa Rica and be on the beach every day. And yet the suffering and the different negative emotions in your mind are going to continue because, and there was a famous book, John Kabat-Zinn, wherever you go, there you are, which is, wherever you go, you're all of a sudden you're the, most successful entrepreneur. You're the best spiritual teacher in the world. You're the, I don't know, living in, I said Costa Rica, so I'll stick with that one. You're still going to be there and your mind is still going to be there with you. If you haven't worked on that, then you're still going to be suffering. So then what's the alternative? It's not to wait for the world to change or to try to change the world. I mean, yes, you can still take action towards what you believe is right. That's important. This isn't Buddhism isn't a passive thing. It doesn't, right action is one of the eight fold path, one of the main elements. So we still want to act in altruistic ways. We still want to be generous. We still want to, take action when needed. But at the same time, we have to know that we can't expect our happiness to come as a result of whatever that is. So our happiness more comes from working and taming our inner mind. And there's actually a great quote that from Shanti Deva, another one of the major masters that we quote in the book, a classical Indian Buddhist, and he says this: "Where would I find enough leather to cover the entire surface of the earth? But with the leather soles in my feet, it's as if the whole world has been covered." And so what he's saying there, and this is an analogy to the mind, is you could try to patch up the entire world and try to make it perfect, and but the thing is something's going to come up no matter what. But if you can, his analogy with the shoes. So if you just wear shoes with a leather soles, you can walk over the earth and be comfortable wherever you are. So it's the same thing with the mind. If you just work on your mind, your internal state, whether that's through meditation, Christianity, prayer, whatever that is, then no matter what condition the world's in, you can be in a good place. I'm not saying that's easy. I'm someone who struggles just as much as everyone else out there, and that's part of the reason why I'm still very much practicing. But I think that's more promising and more real, more attainable than wishing or thinking things are going to be different by attaining some next level, because that's just not the case. So instead, the thing I would encourage everyone to do is start working on your mind, and that's where we can start to find our peace.
So good. Brendan, my friend, we're just about out of time, but this has been a lot of fun. I appreciate you and the work that you and Pema are doing, and thanks for making time for me.
Yeah, thanks so much for having me, Glenn. It's been a lot of fun.
Absolutely. And real quick, is there any place online you want to direct us to go interact more with you or your work or the book?
So two places. We are on Instagram, which is daily.buddhist. So you can find us on there. And then our book and our business you can find at thedailybuddhist.net. Um, the book is out May 27th. So I don't know when this is coming, but it'll be out very soon.
Awesome. I'll put the links in the show notes and maybe we can do it again sometime.
All right. Thanks, Glenn.
Thanks, my friend.